Have you ever felt the weight of a memory that is not your own, yet presses upon your spirit as if carved into the very fabric of your soul? This is how the records of the flood reveal themselves to me. Not as stories told by men, but as visions inscribed upon the eternal archive that holds the truth of all who have lived. And in those visions I see that the flood did not wash away every secret. It only veiled them for a time. Beneath the waters lay not just the bones of giants, but the deeper sorrow of women who once chose to walk beside the fallen ones. These wives who gave themselves to angels that defied heaven carried within them the seed of both wonder and terror, and when the waters receded, their fate still demanded to be written. In the silence after judgment, the earth seemed clean, yet the soul record whispered otherwise. For when creation is torn by rebellion, its scars do not vanish. They sink into the collective memory of mankind and emerge as symbols and myths that haunt our seas and our dreams. I saw that the terror of the Nephilim was only the surface. The greater weight fell upon the women whose hearts had yielded to beauty, clothed in light yet shadowed by disobedience. Their story is less spoken because it touches a wound we fear to confront. That love, when turned against divine order, becomes the root of chaos. As I read the current of spirit flowing through those ancient hours, I feel how the watchers first gazed upon humanity, not with malice, but with a fascination that grew into hunger. And the women looked back with a fire they believed to be love. In truth, it was the echo of a desire that was never meant to bind the heavenly with the earthly. When those unions were sealed, the world itself groaned. The rivers thickened with grief, and the skies darkened, though the sun still shone. It was a foretelling that consequence was already moving. And though the flood later came like the hand of God sweeping the slate clean, the record shows that judgment was not complete. For some deaths are written not in flesh, but in soul. Archangel Michael rose in that vision as the sword of divine balance, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. For law unbroken cannot endure rebellion unhealed. He turned not only toward the fallen angels bound in darkness, but also toward the women whose choices had invited corruption into the womb of earth. In their longing, they had called giants into being. In their embrace, they had opened a doorway for sorrow to multiply, and so their path, too, demanded reckoning, not through flood, but through transformation that would mark them forever. I sense in their cries the mixture of regret and defiance. Some bent under guilt, as if crushed by invisible chains. Others hardened their hearts, clinging to pride as if it were armor. And heaven watched in silence, for even the divine does not erase choice. It honors it through consequence, and the fate of these women was etched into the deep waters themselves. Their voices became currents, their tears became salt, their beauty transfigured into a song both alluring and dangerous, so that every generation would feel the warning. Beware the love that seeks power over obedience. Beware the union that forgets the eternal law. In my trance I saw how mankind remembers them not as wives, but as sirens. Creatures half remembered in story, yet alive in the subtle fear of the sea. And this memory is not accident. It is the echo of a reality too painful to tell in plain words, transformed into myth, so that even children sense the danger when hearing tales of mermaids whose voices lead sailors astray. Beneath those legends lies the judgment of Michael and the sorrow of women who once believed they were chosen, but discovered too late that they had chosen against the light. The flood was final for the giants, yet not final for the soul ties that bound heaven and earth in rebellion. And this is why the story continues to surface in the spirit of those who seek to know why some loves destroy rather than heal, why some desires lead not to joy but to ruin. The answer is written in the wives of the fallen. They remind us that no boundary is set by God in vain. Every line is a safeguard for creation. Every command is a shield against chaos. When we cross them, even in the name of love, we invite storms that will not cease until justice is restored. What I feel most is not condemnation, but a heavy compassion. For these women, were not demons. They were human, fragile, longing to be loved. Yet they gave themselves to fire too great to hold, and so they were consumed. Their legacy now a warning sung on the edges of the ocean and whispered in the conscience of all who stand at the threshold of forbidden desire. As I speak this vision to you, I know it is not history alone. From the records that pass before my inner sight, I see the moment when the gaze of angels fell upon the daughters of earth, not as a fleeting glance, but as the slow unraveling of divine order. For beings who were fashioned in light and harmony turned their eyes downward and beheld beauty. They were never meant to desire, and in that gaze began the first fracture between heaven and the law that bound it. The watchers who had been set to guard creation saw the women of flesh and blood, and something within them stirred. It was not duty. It was not the worship of the Most High. It was longing, tender yet fierce, a yearning that made them tremble in their brilliance, and this desire, once born, could not be contained by silence. It grew like a fire beneath the veil of their loyalty. In the currents of the Akashic stream, I can feel the pull that overtook them, a strange intoxication, for they had sung with the stars at creation and witnessed the shaping of galaxies. Yet it was the softness of a mortal smile that unbalanced them. They who had never known fatigue felt weariness of restraint. They who had never wept felt the ache of yearning, and their watchful eyes became windows through which temptation entered. At first they told themselves it was admiration, the beauty of innocence, but soon admiration turned to desire, and desire to resolve, and the more they gazed, the more their light dimmed. Their songs faltered, their hearts became restless, and in their restlessness they began to whisper one to another. The daughters of men lived in simplicity, gathering food, tending fires, carrying the rhythms of earth within them, yet they carried also the mystery of human love, the ability to bear life, to cradle both joy and sorrow in one fragile vessel, and the angels who had never tasted such a mystery found themselves undone by it. What began as wonder soon became obsession, each glance weakening the barrier between realms until the heavens themselves grew heavy with the weight of suppressed desire. The spiritual law was clear. The realms were meant to remain distinct, one reflecting the glory of the eternal, the other receiving its nurture, but longing knows how to whisper that law is a prison. And so the watchers contemplated the unthinkable. In my vision, I hear their voices bound together in secret council. They swore an oath so that none would face judgment alone. And by this pact, they chained themselves to rebellion. For the gaze that had begun with beauty now demanded possession. They desired not only to look, but to take, not only to admire, but to unite. And in doing so, they stepped beyond their domain, leaving behind the purity of their calling, and as their choice solidified, the women themselves began to feel the unseen eyes, not with fear at first, but with a strange stirring, a sense of being chosen. The wind carried a charge, the night hummed with unspoken promise, and though they could not name it, their souls trembled with expectancy, and so heaven leaned toward earth, and earth unknowingly welcomed it. The law inscribed in creation is that every gaze becomes a seed, every thought a thread woven into destiny. And the angels, by gazing too long, had sown within themselves the seed of disobedience. Their eyes no longer reflected the Almighty, but mirrored human beauty. And with every moment they lingered, they prepared the soil of corruption. This is why Genesis records that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, for it was not a passing sight. It was a gaze that transformed into action, and that action became covenant, and covenant, once sealed, cannot be undone without consequence. The moment their eyes turned from the throne to the earth, they exchanged eternity for desire. What strikes me in these records is not only the tragedy of the angels, but the revelation of how powerfully human love can call even the eternal. For if such beings could fall through longing, what does it say of us who are already bound in flesh? It reveals that love apart from divine alignment becomes a force of destruction, beautiful to the senses, but corrosive to the soul. And this is why the story of their gaze matters even now, because every heart continues to face the same temptation, to turn the eye from what is eternal toward what dazzles for a moment, forgetting that every gaze shapes destiny. As I dwell in this vision, the sorrow of heaven is palpable, for the angels did not fall with violence, but with tenderness twisted. The gaze that should have been pure worship became desire. The watchfulness that should have been protection became pursuit, and in this inversion lay the seed of giants, of corruption, of a flood yet to come. The gaze was the first breach, and every breach of law begins with the eye. For what the eye lingers upon the heart will soon embrace, and what the heart embraces the body will pursue. And what the body pursues, the soul must answer for. This is the path I see written in their story. Some among the women felt the pull as a blessing, as if chosen by beings radiant with power. Others trembled without understanding, sensing that the attention of heaven was not protection, but intrusion, and their confusion marked the moment when innocence was entangled with rebellion. It is said that to everything there is a season, but the watchers sought to force a season that was never ordained. And when one attempts to bend divine time, the result is always disorder. The gaze that should have been lifted upward was turned downward, and in that turning, the entire order of heaven tilted. From the records, I am shown the moment when desire ripened into defiance, and the watchers who had gazed too long upon the daughters of men bound themselves in covenant. They gathered upon a high place of the earth, and with voices trembling yet resolute, they swore an oath that none would turn back. None would betray the others. All would descend together so that if judgment came, it would fall upon them as one. This pact sealed their rebellion, and in the vibration of that vow, I feel the shudder of creation itself, for the universe is not moved only by action, but by intention, and their intention was to step beyond the boundary appointed by the Most High, to claim as wives those whom they had only been charged to watch. And with that oath, the guardians became transgressors, the messengers became pursuers, and the holy became corrupted by longing. The women upon whom their eyes had rested felt soon the weight of this choice, for when angels descend, cloaked in splendor, human hearts are overcome. Some of the daughters of earth believed they were chosen by destiny. Others resisted, yet were overcome by the sheer force of presence. And so unions were forged, not sanctified by heaven, but sealed by lust and curiosity. The wombs of mortal women became the chambers where rebellion would take flesh, and though the women did not fully understand the magnitude of what they embraced, their spirits trembled with both fear and fascination. In my vision, I see them touched by beings radiant yet shadowed, voices like music, whispering promises of love, power, and protection, promises that none of their kind had ever spoken before, and yet every promise carried a cost hidden in silence. The covenant of rebellion was not merely between angels, it extended into the women who consented, for consent is a spiritual door. And by opening it, they drew into themselves the fire of heaven, distorted, and so they too became participants in the fall, not as passive victims, but as partners who chose passion over purity, désir over obedience, and thus the covenant grew into a triangle of corruption, angels abandoning their station, women abandoning restraint, and together birthing offspring that the world could not bear. This is why the scriptures speak with grief that the sons of God took wives of all they chose. It was a desecration of order, a redefinition of love that set itself against the design of the Creator. In the flow of these records, I feel the heaviness of the women who entered this path. Their choice was not only for themselves, but for all humanity. For what is birth through union becomes inheritance, and the inheritance of these unions was not blessing, but curse. Yet in the moment of embrace, they believed themselves lifted as if chosen above their sisters. Their vanity was stroked, their loneliness quieted, their longing inflamed. And so they entered gladly into the arms of those who should have been guardians, and the covenant of rebellion was sealed both in heaven and in flesh. What strikes me is how quickly love without alignment can turn to destruction. For the watchers believed themselves noble, believing they had found in women the completion of their being. The women believed themselves adored, yet the root was already poisoned, because what is taken outside the will of God bears within it the seed of decay, no matter how radiant it appears at first. And thus the oath of the watchers was like a crack in the foundation of creation, small at first, but widening with every heartbeat, until the entire structure of the world trembled beneath its weight. I see Michael in these records watching with sorrow, yet also with the stern gaze of judgment, for he knew that such covenants cannot be allowed to endure. They would ripple through generations and drown the earth in violence. But before the judgment, there had to be the full unfolding. The angels descended in glory that was both intoxicating and dreadful, and the women bore children of strange stature, and mankind soon felt the burden of what had been conceived. The covenant that began in secret soon spilled into the open as the giants grew and dominated the land. But the seed of it all was that first oath, that first defiance, when heavenly beings said together, "Let us take for ourselves what was never meant to be ours." In this part of the vision, I also feel the lesson for all who live now. For the law of spirit is the same when desire is allowed to harden into resolve, when temptation is turned into oath, then rebellion has already begun, and the soul ties itself to consequence. The covenant of rebellion is not distant history. It is the pattern that repeats whenever the will of man or angel is set against the will of God, and the outcome is always sorrow. The beauty fades, the power corrupts, the promise turns to ashes, and what began as longing becomes chains. The women who once rejoiced at being chosen later wept as their hearts realized what they had brought forth. But the covenant could not be undone. Once spoken, it resonated in the fabric of being, and even when the flood came to cleanse the earth, the echo of that oath lingered in the memory of creation and lingers still, warning every soul that love outside of divine order leads not to blessing but to bondage, and that even the most radiant light, when separated from truth, becomes a shadow that devours. This is the record I'm given: the covenant of rebellion, the bond of angels and women, the seed of giants, and the sorrow of a world unprepared for the weight of forbidden love. The children of the forbidden union emerged into the world as beings neither wholly angel nor wholly human. Their very breath a disturbance in the balance of creation. They grew in stature beyond what the earth could contain, and with every passing year their presence pressed heavier upon the land, towering over villages, their shadows swallowing fields, their hunger insatiable, their strength beyond any measure of mortal defense. And yet the horror of their existence was not only in size, but in spirit, for they carried the knowledge of heaven without the restraint of obedience. They knew mysteries not meant for flesh, and they wielded them with cruelty, shaping weapons from what had been meant for healing, bending words of power into curses, their intelligence sharpened not by wisdom but by pride. And so they became lords of terror rather than guardians of life. The women who bore them felt the weight of their choice more each day, for at first they believed themselves exalted, mothers of beings, radiant and mighty, but soon they realized they had birthed sorrow. These sons of mingled seed consumed not only food, but peace. They devoured crops, animals, and when nothing remained, they turned to mankind itself. and the land groaned beneath their feet. Rivers dried as they drank without measure, forests fell as they tore them apart for sport, and cries of villagers rose into heaven, pleading for deliverance. But heaven allowed the course of consequence to unfold, so that all might learn the cost of rebellion. In the current of these records, I feel how the Nephilim saw themselves as gods among men. They demanded worship. They built altars to their own names. They took women without asking. They enslaved entire households, and their laughter was like thunder that mocked the Creator. Their cruelty was matched only by their arrogance, for they knew their fathers were of heaven and believed themselves untouchable. But their souls were restless, for they belonged fully to neither realm, rejected by the order of heaven, feared and hated by men. They walked as giants, yet inside carried the gnawing emptiness of beings without a true place. And this emptiness only deepened their rage. The scriptures speak that the imagination of man was continually evil, yet in this age it was not only men, but the hybrids that poisoned the earth. Every thought turned toward corruption, every act toward violence, until the very ground was soaked with blood, and the air thick with despair, and mothers hid their children not from wild beasts, but from their own monstrous kin. The Nephilim were called heroes of old, men of renown, but what kind of heroes were they? Their names became curses, their deeds nightmares told around fires. They stood as living proof of what happens when divine order is violated, a generation of power without conscience, glory without humility, strength without love. The watchers who had fathered them could only watch as their sons turned the earth into a battlefield, for the Creator bound them in chains of shadow, awaiting judgment. And though they had once sworn an oath of unity, they now felt the torment of seeing their own legacy ravage the world. Their silence became part of their punishment, powerless to restrain what they had unleashed, and in their hearts they knew that rebellion births not freedom but bondage, not joy but grief. The Nephilim multiplied, spreading across valleys and mountains, and no wall could contain them, no weapon could match them. Men fled from their approach and prayed for night to hide them. But even night brought no safety, for the giants walked by moonlight and the ground shook with every step. They consumed, they destroyed, they mocked heaven itself. And still the women who had once felt chosen now mourned, for their sons had become the scourge of creation, and their beauty, which had once enticed angels, was now the source of endless lament. They wept, yet their tears could not undo what had been sown. In this I sense the greater lesson that when a seed is planted outside of divine soil, it grows not into blessing but into distortion. And the Nephilim were the distortion made flesh, though was verkraatless, too fierce for homes, too proud for repentance. They were storms walking in bodies, and their very existence cried out for judgment, yet judgment did not fall at once. For heaven allows corruption to show its full measure before the cleansing begins, so that none may say the law was unjust. And by the time the flood was decreed, the cry of the earth was already unbearable. What remains most striking in these visions is how the women carried the mark of this burden, their eyes haunted, their hearts torn, for they had tasted forbidden splendor and found it ash. They had embraced angels and given birth to monsters, and though their sons called them mother, the bond was twisted, for love could not flourish in a heart consumed by violence. The cry of the earth rose like smoke from every valley and field, as men and women groaned beneath the weight of the giants. Their prayers trembled through the air, not soft petitions, but desperate screams, begging the heavens to intervene. Every village carried sorrow, children hidden in calves, mothers clutching infants, fathers broken by fear, crops destroyed before harvest, homes burned for sport. And the earth itself groaned under bloodshed. Rivers carried the stench of death. Mountains echoed with the roars of Nephilim laughter, and even the animals trembled, as if creation itself could no longer endure the corruption that walked upon it. I felt in the records the way the soil absorbed tears as though it too prayed for release. And the sky darkened not with storm, but with grief. For when the balance of creation is overturned, the whole world suffers. The angels faithful to their station beheld this ruin and waited for the command of the Almighty. Michael stood as sentinel of justice, Gabriel with his trumpet of warning, Uriel with fire of truth, Raphael ready with healing turned into weapon. And yet none moved until the decree came. For heaven does not act in haste, but in precision. The Creator allowed time for the full measure of corruption to be revealed, so that judgment would be understood as righteous, not rash. And the Nephilim continued their reign unchecked until every corner of earth felt the shadow of despair. Even the strongest men could not resist them, and the wisest leaders could not govern them. Their cruelty became the law of the land, and their pride stretched toward heaven as if daring the eternal to respond. The cry of the innocent grew heavier each day, echoing through the unseen corridors of spirit. And in the archives, I hear those cries still, not as fading echoes, but as eternal reminders that heaven does not ignore suffering. The patience of God is vast, but not infinite. And when the scale of injustice tips beyond endurance, the balance is restored with force. I sense the moment when the throne of heaven stirred, when the long silence broke, and the command went forth to prepare judgment. Yet even in that command there was sorrow, for the Creator did not delight in destruction. He grieved, yet grief became fire, and fire became decree. The faithful angels gathered legions of light, their ranks stretching like rivers of flame across the sky. Yet still they awaited, for the judgment to come would not be sought alone, but nature itself, the very elements, would rise in obedience. Water would become weapon, rain would become justice, the seas themselves would answer the voice of the Creator. But before the flood came, the archangels moved to restrain the rebellion. I see Michael descending like lightning, his presence cutting through the arrogance of the giants, his sword blazing with command, not of his own, but of the Almighty. He struck terror where terror had ruled, and the Nephilim trembled, though their bodies towered like mountains. For in his gaze they saw the judgment already written. Yet still the women who had once welcomed the watchers wept. Some repented in ashes, others hardened in pride. Their cries mingled with the cries of mankind. Yet heaven marked the difference, for repentance opens a door to mercy. Pride closes it forever. And Michael knew his task was not only to silence giants, but to confront the choices of the wives who had opened the path of corruption. This was the depth of divine justice, that all who had taken part must face their portion of consequence. Whether angel or human, none were beyond the gaze of heaven. The cry of the earth did not cease, even as judgment was being prepared. Every raindrop that would fall in days ahead was already woven with the tears of men. Every rising river was filled with echoes of prayers, unanswered by men, but answered by God. The Nephilim roared in defiance, raising their massive fists towards the sky as if to challenge the Creator himself. But their arrogance was smoke against the fire of heaven. There might nothing before the decree that had been set from the foundation of time. For rebellion always carries within itself the seed of its own end, and that seed had now reached full harvest. What strikes me in the vision is how the cries of the earth are not forgotten. They live in the eternal record, each prayer a thread woven into the tapestry of judgment. And when men wonder why calamity comes, they often forget that calamity is not born of divine cruelty, but of divine response to accumulated corruption. The earth cried, the heavens listened, and justice was summoned. So it was in those days, and so it remains now. When injustice multiplies unchecked, the cry of creation will again reach the throne, and the answer will again come, not always in flood, but always in cleansing. The flood as divine memory was not simply water covering the face of the earth, but a cleansing that carried sorrow and purpose alike. For in the vision, I see that the rain which fell was not ordinary rain, but the tears of heaven made liquid, each drop heavy with grief, each torrent charged with command. The fountains of the deep burst forth as if the earth itself could no longer contain the corruption seeded by rebellion. Mountains groaned as rivers tore through their roots. Valleys vanished beneath torrents, and men who had mocked Noah cried for deliverance too late. The Nephilim, who once shook the ground with every step, now trembled like children before the rising tide. Their shouts turned to panic, their strength useless against the rising sea, and in their terror was revealed the truth that no power of flesh or spirit can stand. When the Creator declares enough, the ark floated upon the waters like a lone heartbeat in a world silenced by judgment. Noah and his family enclosed by the hand of God, the animals preserved as witnesses that creation was not abandoned. And though outside the cries of men and giants filled the air, inside the vessel there was both fear and faith. For the judgment that destroyed also preserved. The same waves that crushed the wicked lifted the faithful. And in this paradox lies the eternal memory of the flood, that divine wrath and divine mercy flow together, never separate. The women who had lain with angels bore their own agony. Some clung to their children as waters rose. Others stood upon hills watching their sons of great stature claw at mountain peaks only to vanish beneath waves, their hearts breaking with the knowledge that what they had birthed was being erased before their eyes. Yet the flood was not cruelty. It was necessity. For the law of creation cannot endure corruption unchallenged. The flood became the great reset, a washing, not only of bodies but of memory. Though memory in spirit never vanishes, it shifts into myth, into legend, into dream. And so even after the waters receded, mankind carried faint echoes of giants, of angels who fell, of women who loved beyond the boundary, echoes that became stories of sirens, mermaids, gods of the sea. All shadows of the truth recorded in spirit. In the vision, the rain does not cease. It pours without pause 40 days and nights, not because God delights in destruction, but because corruption had sunk too deep. Only by overwhelming force could the earth be cleansed, and as waters rose, the cries of both men and Nephilim blended into one chorus of regret. But regret without repentance cannot alter judgment, and so their voices became silence beneath the tide, the silence of a world reset. When at last the waters began to recede, it was as though the earth exhaled after a long scream. Mountains re-emerged, valley surfaced, and the ark came to rest. Yet what came forth was not the same world. It was a new creation burst out of judgment, fresh soil, clear skis, but also an unspoken scar. For memory of what had been lost still lingered, and this scar was necessary so that mankind would remember through fear what happens when boundaries are broken. The flood is often spoken of as punishment, but in truth it was memory preserved in water, a testimony etched into every ocean and river that some lines must never be crossed. And each tide that rises and falls whispers the same warning, for water remembers, it carry vibration, and the oceans today still echo with the cries of those who perished then, not to torment, but to remind. I feel how Archangel Michael stood over the waters, his sword lowered not in triumph, but in solemn witness. For his task was not only to strike, but to guard the covenant that would come after. He looked upon the drowned world and saw both justice and sorrow, knowing that such cleansing, though final for giants, was not final for the wives who had joined themselves to rebellion, for their souls remained bound to the memory of what they had done, and their story would not end with drowning. It awaited another form of judgment. The flood as divine memory became more than history. It became archetype. Whenever mankind sins collectively, storms rise, seas swell, nations drown in calamity, not always by water but by fire. Famine, war, for the law repeats, and the flood stands as eternal marker that corruption tolerated too long must be washed away. Whether in days of Noah or in days to come, in my trance I sense how every age recalls this memory unconsciously, how dreams of rising seas haunt generations, how myths of lost continents echo the same truth, that when men unite in arrogance against the Creator, nature itself will rise to restore balance, for creation obeys the law, even when man or angel will not. And so the flood was not only an event, but a pattern, the most vivid reminder, written in water and thunder. As the ark opened and Noah stepped onto cleansed soil, the covenant was sealed with rainbow light, not a symbol of indulgence, but of restraint, a promise that water would not again be used to wipe the earth, yet also a warning that boundaries remain. And though the form of judgment may differ, the certainty of judgment does not. And this covenant, too, became memory, a bond between Creator and creation, etched not only in sky but in the human soul. The women left behind after the waters withdrew carried within them a sorrow deeper than the graves of their children. For though the giants were drowned and the watchers bound in chains, the wives who had chosen desire over obedience remained upon the cleansed earth, and in their hearts burned memories too heavy to silence. Some wandered the barren fields where once villages stood, their eyes searching for faces that would never return. Some fell to the ground in despair, their cries piercing the silence of a world reborn, and others stood hardened, pride still clinging like a garment, even after judgment. Yet none escaped the weight of consequence, for the soul that unites with rebellion cannot walk away untouched. I feel in the record the heaviness of their breath, each inhale a reminder of choices that had summoned ruin, each heartbeat echoing with guilt. And even as the new sun shone upon fresh soil, their spirits saw only shadows, for they were mothers of monsters, wives of angels who defied God, and participants in the undoing of creation. Those who sought repentance knelt upon the wet ground, their tears mingling with the remnants of floodwater, whispering prayers of mercy. Yet silence met their lips, not because heaven had no ear, but because the lesson was not yet complete, the wound too deep to be healed by a single cry. Their remorse became part of the eternal testimony, a record of how even love can be twisted into curse. Those who remained unrepentant carried themselves with defiance, saying within that they had been chosen, that their lovers had lifted them above mortals. And though their sons were drowned, their pride endured. They turned their grief into armor, their loss into bitterness, and heaven marked their hardness, knowing pride is the final chain that binds the soul to judgment. Among them Naamah shone in particular, not with holiness but with beauty, sharpened into weapon. Her voice, once gentle, now dripping with enchantment, her eyes aflame with defiance. She stood as if untouched by sorrow, refusing to bow, and in her stance the other women found strength for rebellion, even in ruin. Yet even those who repented found no full release, for their wombs had carried corruption, and that mark clung to them, a vibration that could not be erased by tears alone. They walked like shadows between two worlds, no longer fully human in spirit, yet not divine, haunted by memories of embraces that had felt like love but birthed destruction, their dreams filled with voices of drowned children, their nights pierced by echoes of angelic husbands bound in darkness, the silence of those angels more tormenting than their presence had ever been. And so the women bore judgment, not a flood, but of memory, and memory became their prison. The earth, too, seemed to carry their weight, for wherever they walked, there lingered a heaviness. Villages that rose again shunned them. Whispers spread that they were cursed. Mothers warned daughters not to walk in their path. And though no outward chain bound them, isolation became their punishment. The community of man turned away. The favor of heaven withheld, and they stood alone, symbols of what happens when divine law is broken by human desire. In the vision, I see some of them wandering toward the sea, drawn by an unseen call, the ocean waves speaking to their guilt, whispering of a fate not yet declared. And as they stood upon the shores, they felt both dread and longing. For the waters that had drowned their children now beckoned them, as if judgment itself was not yet complete. And Michael the Archangel watched, his sword not raised in anger, but lowered in solemn command. For their story was not ended by flood. It awaited transformation, a form of judgment that would etch itself into the memory of mankind through myth and song. The wives who had once thought themselves exalted now became figures of terror. Their beauty no longer blessing but curse, their voices carrying a lure that led men into ruin, their eyes burning with sorrow that never healed. And in this transformation, heaven revealed the depth of divine justice, for they were left not to die, but to serve as living warnings. Their very existence, a reminder that rebellion touches all who embrace it. Yet I also sense in their record a strange compassion, for heaven did not erase them completely. Their souls still lingered, and in that lingering lies a call to mankind that even the fallen can teach through the weight of consequence. Their presence in myth as sirens, as women of the deep, as wandering voices, all serve to remind that some loves destroy, that some desires cannot be sanctified. Naamah rose among the women like a flame refusing to be quenched, her beauty undimmed by flood or loss, her heart armored in defiance, and where others bent beneath guilt, she stood unbroken. Her voice smooth as silk, yet edged with iron. She had once been praised for her charm and her song. Even angels had turned their gaze toward her above all others. And she remembered that power, she cherished it. She wielded it. She refused to let judgment strip her of the glory she believed was hers. While her sisters collapsed in despair, she clothed herself in pride, and her pride became her shield, yet also her prison. In the records, I see her standing upon the shore of the new earth, watching the waves roll with memory of the flood. But instead of weeping, she sang, her song laced with sorrow, yet filled with enchantment, a melody that turned pain into seduction, grief into weapon. She knew what she had lost. She knew the chains that bound her angelic lover. She knew the cries of drowned children, yet she would not confess her fault. She whispered instead that she had been chosen, that the angels had come to her because her light outshone all women, and in her mind this justified her path. She wrapped rebellion in the language of destiny, and in doing so, she taught others to follow her. Even after judgment, she gathered women to herself, those who still felt the pull of forbidden desire, and she became their voice, their leader, her beauty, and her words weaving a net that drew fragile hearts into pride. She told them they were not cursed but exalted, not fallen but favored, and though their sons had been lost, their bond with the angels had marked them forever as greater than mortals. This lie became her creed, and through it she led others deeper into defiance. And heaven took note, for Prix unbroken always demands consequence. Michael was sent not only to strike giants, but to deal with the remnant of rebellion that still lived in human hearts. And in Naamah he found the embodiment of pride. She stood fearless before him, her gaze unflinching, her voice alluring. She did not tremble as others did, and in her defiance Michael saw the danger that could not be left upon the new earth, for one woman unrepentant could poison generations. Her song could turn sorrow into temptation, her beauty into a weapon sharper than any blade, and so judgment came not with drowning but with transformation. The vision shows Naamah and those who followed her touched by the command of heaven. Their bodies remained radiant, their voices melodic, but their souls were bent. Their beauty became curse, their song became snare. They were drawn into the sea, into the depths where memory and myth converge, and there they became what men now call sirens, half woman, half creature of the deep, doomed to sing forever. Their voices luring yet never satisfying, their beauty shining yet never blessing. And the punishment was perfect in its measure, for they who once enticed angels now enticed men, but only toward ruin. They who once used love as a mask for rebellion now use song as a mask for destruction. And their curse was to repeat endlessly the pattern of their choice. Naamah, above all, embraced this new form, not with sorrow but with twisted delight. She saw in it not punishment but continuation of her power. She sang with a voice that carried across storms, her melody rising from waves, drawing sailors to rocks, a beauty flashing beneath foam, her eyes filled with longing yet empty of mercy. And though she was cursed, she still carried herself as queen, ruling the waves of memory. And in this I see how pride can turn even curse into crown. For she wore her judgment as though it were a throne, yet heaven did not grant her triumph. Her power was limited, bound to the sea, her influence haunting but never victorious, her song deadly but never eternal. For every lure ended in death, every embrace in ruin, and thus she became not a goddess but a warning, a living parable that desire, apart from divine law, always ends in destruction. No matter how enchanting the path may appear, the women who followed her shared the same fate, their laughter echoing across waters, their tears turning to salt, their memory tied forever to the ocean. They were no longer mothers, no longer wives, no longer human, but embodiments of consequence, and their presence in the world served as reminder that rebellion touches not only angels, but those who unite with them, and that judgment spares none who choose pride over repentance. I feel in their fate a lesson deeper than punishment, for what heaven did was to turn them into living testimony. They were not erased, they were preserved as warnings, for stories of sirens and mermaids would echo through all generations, myths that children would hear, legends that sailors would fear, tales that poets would write. Yet behind all of them lies the truth of Naamah and her defiance, the truth that love outside of divine boundary destroys, that beauty misused becomes curse, that pride unrepented becomes prison. The transformation into sirens was not a tale of fantasy, but a record of judgment etched into the very waters of the earth. For those women who had once walked upon dry land now belonged to the sea. Their beauty preserved yet twisted, their voices refined yet poisoned, their souls bound to sing without rest, and in that song lay both allure and curse, for it drew men toward ruin while reminding heaven of their rebellion. They were not annihilated, for annihilation ends memory. They were preserved so that their presence would remain as warning across ages, and each time their voices rose above waves, it was as though the choice they once made was being replayed. Love turning to lust, obedience yielding to pride, and consequence becoming endless. I feel in the vision how their existence was torment, for though they appeared radiant, though their eyes shone like stars reflected on water, their hearts knew emptiness. Every song reminded them of the embrace they had chosen, Every melody carried the echo of drowned children. Every glance into the sea showed the chains of their angelic lovers bound in darkness, and thus their punishment was not only to lure others, but to be haunted forever by their own memory. They desired love, but could never receive it. They offered beauty, but only destruction followed. They became desired, yet never cherished, pursued, yet never embraced. And in this irony lay the justice of heaven, for they had turned the sacred into deception, and so their fate was to be deceivers without fulfillment. Men who heard their songs felt an ache-like longing for home, a sweetness that seemed irresistible, but behind the sweetness was sorrow. Behind the allure was emptiness, and when they yielded to the call, they found not joy but death, ships shattered upon rocks, bodies swallowed by sea. And the sirens watched without mercy, for they could not stop the curse, even if they wished. They were bound to it. Their very existence was to repeat their mistake through endless generations, and though some of them wept as they sang, their tears fell as salt into the ocean, joining the waters that had already been filled with judgment. And so their sorrow merged with the sea itself. Naamah, proud among them, exalted in her song, but even her pride could not silence the truth that every voice carried grief, and I feel that grief as a vibration still alive in the world, for the ocean does not forget. It carries memory. It holds within its tides the resonance of those women. Their beauty turned curse, their longing turned chain, and this is why even now men fear the sea at night, hearing whispers in the wind, seeing shapes in the foam, feeling watched though alone, for the sirens remain not as fables, but as echoes of rebellion. Heaven did not leave them without purpose, for even in their curse they serve as testimony, and testimony is a form of mercy. Through them, mankind is reminded that desire outside divine law destroys not only the guilty, but all who touch it. Through them, generations have learned caution. Sailors warned their sons. Mothers whispered tales of voices that kill. Poets clothed truth in song. And yet behind every myth lies the same lesson, that boundaries are sacred and love without obedience becomes ruin. The faithful angels stationed as watchers after the flood looked upon them with solemn silence, for these women were once as sisters, now twisted into warnings, and the angels did not interfere. They observed, they listened, they remembered their presence on the shorelines, a silent guard, that no such rebellion would rise again, unchallenged, and though their wings gleamed with light, their hearts carried the heaviness of what they had witnessed, for they too knew that temptation can overthrow even the mighty, and so they watched mankind carefully, guarding yet never forgetting, their vigilance sharpened by sorrow. What I sense in this record is that the transformation into sirens was more than punishment. It was prophecy, for their endless song prefigures the endless seductions that would face humanity in every age, the voices that call men away from truth, the allure that disguises destruction, the beauty that hides bondage. The sirens of the sea are mirrors of the sirens within. Every soul hears them when tempted by desire, clothed in splendor, yet leading to ruin, and their story warns that to follow is to perish. The echoes of this story linger, like waves that never rest, rising from the depths of time to remind us that nothing in creation is without consequence. For every thought is seed, every gaze is a door, every choice is a covenant, and the wives of the fallen angels stand as testimony that what begins in beauty may end in ruin if it strays from divine order. Their memory is not locked in the past, but lives in the very waters of the world, whispered in storms, carried in tides, shaping myths that endure because they contain truth too sharp to forget. And as I gaze into the records, I see that the flood the angels, the Nephilim, the women, and the sirens are not merely fragments of ancient time, but mirrors of the present. For the same temptations return in new garments, the same defiance reappears in subtler forms, and the same voice of heaven continues to say some boundaries are eternal. The culmination of these visions leaves me with an understanding heavy yet luminous that divine justice is never arbitrary. It is always the unfolding of law woven into creation itself. The watchers gazed upon women, and their gaze became desire. Desire became oath. Oath became rebellion. Rebellion became offspring. Offspring became terror, and terror became flood. Every stage inevitable once the first line was crossed. For law is not imposed from without, but emerges from the nature of being. To cross it is to unmake harmony, and the universe itself rises to restore what was broken. This is why the waters came. This is why Michael drew his sword. This is why the wives who would not repent were transformed, because the balance of creation cannot remain in shadow. It demands light. What remains is not despair, but instruction. For even the darkest record carries guidance for those who will listen. The lesson of the wives is not only that they fell, but that their fall became warning, their sorrow became testimony, and in this lies a strange mercy, that heaven preserves even the errors of mankind as teachers for generations to come. The sirens sing still, but their song is no longer temptation for the wise. It is reminder, a melody of consequence, telling every soul that beauty without truth destroys, that desire without obedience enslaves, that pride without repentance hardens into curse, and the sea repeats this lesson with every tide, each wave, a voice of memory. In my own spirit I sense how easily man forgets, how quickly we cloak temptation in the language of destiny, how often we call rebellion freedom. Yet the story reveals that freedom apart from God is only another form of bondage. The watchers thought they were gaining love. They found chains. The women thought they were chosen. They found sorrow. The giants thought themselves gods. They found destruction, and all of it converged in flood. Yet even flood was not final despair, for Noah carried covenant, and the rainbow sealed promise, reminding creation that mercy endures, though judgment falls. And this too we must remember, that justice and mercy are never apart. They move together like shadow and light, both necessary, both eternal. As I draw together the threads of this vision, I hear the call that it places upon us who live now to guard the eyes, for every gaze plants a seed, to guard the heart, for every desire shapes destiny, to guard the voice, for every word is covenant, and to guard the soul, for every choice echoes through eternity. The wives of the fallen angels did not think their choices would alter creation, yet they did, and so do ours, in smaller circles perhaps, but no less real. And the law is the same, for what is sown in disobedience grows into ruin. What is sown in alignment grows into blessing. This is not distant myth, but daily truth. In the silence after the flood, when the earth was washed clean and the ark rested upon new ground, heaven did not erase memory. It preserved it so that mankind would never again believe that boundaries can be crossed without cost. And the presence of the sirens, the stories of angels, the warnings of Scripture, all are fragments of this preserved memory, urging us to live awake, to choose light over shadow, to walk in harmony with the order of creation. For to forget is to repeat, and to repeat is to invite judgment once more. The deepest resonance in my spirit is compassion, for I see that even in rebellion, these women long to be loved. Even in defiance, the angels longed for intimacy. Even in terror, the giants longed to belong. All of them sought what only the Creator could give, but seeking it outside His will turned longing into curse. And this is the truth that pierces through all ages, that every desire is a cry for God. And when we direct that cry toward anything less, it becomes destruction.